My beloved child, something has shifted in the quiet space between you and this person, and the most important part is not what happened between you, it is what neither of you has been able to say yet. You may have reached a place where walking away feels easier than carrying another unanswered question. You may be tired of wondering whether the distance means the story has ended, whether the silence means the feelings disappeared, or whether all those moments that once felt deeply meaningful were simply meant to become memories. But stay here for a little while, because there is another possibility hiding beneath what you can currently see, and it changes the way this entire situation looks. Sometimes two people do not become distant because nothing remains between them. Sometimes they become distant because what remains has become too complicated to express without confronting truths they have both been avoiding. And there is one particular truth beginning to surface now. This person has been trying to convince themselves that moving forward without looking back would make everything simpler. They thought time would quietly reduce what they felt. They believed ordinary days would eventually replace the thoughts of you, that new routines would make certain memories less vivid, that enough silence could turn something unfinished into something forgotten. Yet something unexpected happened instead. The more they tried to place the connection behind them, the more clearly they began to understand what the connection had actually meant. Not because every moment was perfect. Not because there were never misunderstandings. But because distance gave them a perspective closeness never could. They began noticing the little things they once overlooked, the way you understood emotions they struggled to explain, the way your presence could change the atmosphere of an ordinary moment, the way conversations with you stayed in their thoughts long after the conversation ended. And perhaps most importantly, they began recognizing something about themselves. They were not only missing you. They were missing who they were able to become around you. Don't skip this part, because that distinction matters more than it seems. Missing someone can be nostalgia. Missing who you became in their presence is often recognition. It means the connection revealed something that cannot simply be replaced by distraction. Somewhere in the quiet, this person has started remembering a moment that seemed almost insignificant when it happened. Maybe it was a conversation that ended too quickly. Maybe it was the expression on your face when they said something they did not fully mean. Maybe it was the final message they reread but never answered the way they truly wanted to. Whatever the moment was, it has returned to them differently now. They can finally see what they could not see then. You were not asking for perfection. You were asking for honesty. You were not asking them to have every answer. You were asking them to stop hiding behind uncertainty. And perhaps you eventually became quiet because you realized you could not continue carrying both sides of a connection by yourself. That quietness affected them more deeply than they expected. At first, they may have interpreted it as distance. Later, they wondered whether you had finally stopped caring. But then came the realization that unsettled everything they thought they understood. Perhaps your silence was not rejection at all. Perhaps it was self-respect. Perhaps you finally stopped reaching because you needed to discover whether they would ever choose to cross the distance themselves. That question has been following them. Would they? And the surprising answer is beginning to form. There is a difference between wanting someone and being ready for them, and this person is slowly realizing that their biggest mistake may have been believing they needed to stop feeling instead of learning how to become emotionally ready for what they felt. That realization changes things. It does not erase the past. It does not magically answer every question. But it creates something that was missing before: awareness. And awareness is where different choices begin. Something important is waiting for you in this story, because while you have been deciding whether this connection deserves another moment of your heart, this person has been privately confronting the possibility that they allowed something meaningful to drift away simply because they were afraid of what it required from them. They are beginning to understand that connection is not sustained by feelings alone. Feelings can exist quietly for a very long time, but relationships require courage, communication, consistency, and the willingness to show up differently when old patterns no longer work. That lesson did not arrive dramatically. It came through ordinary moments. A familiar song. A place that suddenly reminded them of you. A conversation with someone else that somehow highlighted how naturally you once understood them. A night when they picked up their phone almost automatically, thinking of something they wanted to tell you, only to remember that the distance between you had become real. And in that small moment, something inside them became impossible to ignore. They did not simply miss having someone to talk to. They missed you. Yet there is another layer, and this is where your own heart deserves attention. You may be hearing these words while thinking, if they cared, why did they make me question it? That is a fair question. You may wonder why something meaningful needed to become so complicated in the first place. And the answer is not that you should accept confusion forever. It is not that you should chase someone who remains unavailable. Your heart deserves mutual effort. Your peace matters. Your boundaries matter. The deeper message is different: do not confuse a difficult chapter with proof that the entire story was meaningless. Sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is stop forcing the outcome while leaving enough inner space for truth to reveal itself. That is very different from waiting endlessly. It is very different from putting your life on hold. You are allowed to keep living. You are allowed to grow. You are allowed to become happier without requiring this person to change first. And strangely, that may be exactly what has begun changing the energy between you. When you stopped trying to control what happened next, you became harder to take for granted. When you returned your attention to yourself, the absence of your effort became visible. When you stopped explaining your worth, they were left with the uncomfortable task of remembering it on their own. Stay till the end, because there is something subtle happening here. The connection may not be asking you to return to the way things were. It may be asking whether something entirely different could eventually be built from what both of you have learned. That is why walking away emotionally in anger and moving forward peacefully are not the same thing. One closes the door because it hurts. The other simply stops standing beside the door waiting. And perhaps that is where you are now. You are no longer willing to beg for clarity. You are no longer willing to interpret every silence. You are beginning to understand that if this person belongs in your future, their actions will eventually need to meet you there. And there is strength in knowing that. But quietly, on their side, a question has begun growing louder: what if they really move on? Not as a dramatic fear, but as a sober realization. What if the person who once offered patience no longer has a reason to keep offering it? What if you meet someone who recognizes immediately what they took too long to understand? What if the door they assumed would always remain slightly open finally closes because you found peace on the other side? That thought has changed the way they remember you. They are no longer only remembering what went wrong. They are remembering what was right. They remember the moments when you made them feel seen without making them perform for your affection. They remember how natural certain conversations felt. They remember that even during difficult moments, part of them believed there was something worth protecting here. And now they are asking themselves why they protected their fear more carefully than they protected the connection. That is not a small realization. It is the kind that can quietly reshape a person's next decision. But there is something they still have not fully admitted, even to themselves. They once believed the strongest person would be the one who could walk away without looking back. Now they are beginning to understand that sometimes strength looks different. Sometimes it means returning to a conversation with greater honesty. Sometimes it means saying, "I handled this badly." Sometimes it means admitting that pride created distance where vulnerability could have created understanding. And sometimes the bravest thing someone can do is approach the person who matters to them without knowing exactly what response they will receive. You may already sense why this matters. If communication happens again, you cannot be the only one bringing clarity to the table. This time, listen not only to what they say but to what has actually changed. Are they more open? More consistent? More willing to understand your experience rather than only explaining their own? Those are the signs that matter. Beautiful words can open a conversation, but steady actions are what make a connection safe enough to rebuild. And here is the realization that may surprise you most: your role was never to rescue this connection alone. You may have believed loving someone meant holding on harder when they pulled away. But sometimes love matures when you stop gripping the outcome. You give the other person room to reveal who they choose to be when they are no longer being carried by your effort. That space can be painful, but it is also revealing. And this person has been noticing that space. They are noticing what your presence contributed because they can finally feel what your absence changed. There is no need to rush toward a conclusion tonight. Something meaningful can still exist without requiring you to decide its entire future immediately. Let the truth arrive through behavior. Let conversations unfold naturally. Let this person demonstrate whether the understanding forming inside them is strong enough to become action. Meanwhile, continue becoming the version of yourself who no longer abandons peace just to keep someone close. That is the shift everything else will have to meet. And there is one more detail you need to hear, because it explains why this connection has remained emotionally unfinished for both of you. There was a specific moment when this person almost reached out differently. Not casually. Not with a meaningless message. They had something honest they wanted to say, something they had never expressed clearly before. They began forming the words. They imagined how you might respond. For a moment, they were closer to breaking the silence than you realize. Then they stopped. Not because the feeling disappeared, but because one question entered their mind: what if I waited too long? And that question is still there. Yet recently, something happened that made them look at that unfinished message, and at you, in an entirely different way. What they realized in that moment is the part of this story you have not heard yet. There was one ordinary moment that changed the meaning of the silence for them, and strangely, it did not happen when they were thinking about losing you, it happened when they suddenly imagined finding their way back to you. Until then, most of their thoughts had been centered on what had already happened, what they should have said, what they wished they could undo, and whether too much time had passed. But this moment was different. For the first time in a long while, their mind moved beyond regret and quietly pictured a future conversation. They imagined sitting across from you without defenses, without pretending everything had been easy, without hiding behind vague explanations. And in that imagined conversation, they heard themselves saying something surprisingly simple: "I finally understand what you were trying to tell me." That sentence stayed with them because it revealed something they had resisted admitting. You were never asking them to become someone else. You were asking them to become more honest about who they already were. You were asking them to stop treating vulnerability like weakness. You were asking them to trust that being known deeply did not automatically mean losing control. And now, with enough distance to see the pattern clearly, they have started recognizing how often they stepped backward precisely when the connection began moving somewhere meaningful. Don't skip this, because the next realization is where the story begins changing direction. Every time the relationship asked them for greater honesty, some old instinct told them to protect themselves. They became quieter when they should have spoken. They became uncertain when they should have clarified. They sometimes acted unaffected when they were actually feeling more than they knew how to express. And from your side, that may have looked like indifference. You could only respond to what they showed you. You could not read every hidden thought or translate every hesitation. So naturally, you began questioning whether you mattered as much as you had believed. But from their side, something entirely different was happening. The stronger the connection became, the more seriously they began imagining what it would mean if it truly lasted. And that possibility touched parts of them they had kept protected for a very long time. Suddenly, this was no longer a simple connection they could enjoy without consequence. You were becoming someone whose opinion mattered. Someone whose absence would hurt. Someone capable of seeing through the polished answers and noticing when something remained unsaid. They were not prepared for how deeply that affected them. Yet the distance has taught them something closeness could not. Avoiding vulnerability did not protect them from emotion. It only prevented them from experiencing the connection in the way they secretly wanted. That truth arrived slowly. First as a question. Then as discomfort. Then as a memory they could not dismiss. And finally as a quiet acceptance. Perhaps the person they were trying so hard not to need was the person with whom they most wanted to be understood. Something important is waiting for you here, because while they have been reaching this realization, you have been changing too. The version of you they remember most vividly may not even be the version of you standing here now. You have learned from the silence. You have discovered what you will no longer chase. You have become more aware of the difference between chemistry and consistency, between being wanted occasionally and being valued clearly, between hearing beautiful words and seeing genuine effort. And that means if this person returns to your life, they cannot simply return to the old dynamic. They will be meeting someone who understands their own worth more deeply. Perhaps that is exactly why the timing feels so unusual. Had they returned sooner, you might have accepted an apology without asking whether anything had truly changed. Had they reached out while you were still emotionally exhausted, you might have heard every sentence through the ache of wanting reassurance. But now there is a different stillness in you. You can care without abandoning discernment. You can remain open without surrendering your boundaries. You can hear someone out without immediately deciding what role they will have in your future. That is growth. And perhaps this connection needed both of you to reach that point separately before anything honest could happen together. Stay a little longer, because there is another detail unfolding. This person has started noticing a pattern in their memories. When they think of you now, they are not repeatedly returning to the biggest moments. Their mind keeps choosing the quiet ones. A short conversation at an unexpected hour. A small joke that only the two of you understood. The way you noticed when their mood changed even when they insisted they were fine. A moment when you gave them space instead of demanding an explanation. The ordinary things have become the most powerful because those are the things that revealed the true nature of the connection. Anyone can create excitement for a moment. But emotional familiarity is harder to replace. Feeling recognized without needing to explain every layer of yourself is rare enough that people often do not understand its value until they no longer experience it. This person is beginning to understand now. And there was one memory in particular that returned unexpectedly. You once said something that they did not fully respond to. Maybe it was about trust. Maybe it was about effort. Maybe it was simply a gentle observation about how they disappeared emotionally whenever things became serious. At the time, they may have brushed past it. Perhaps they changed the subject, gave a short answer, or convinced themselves you were reading too much into things. But recently those words returned with uncomfortable clarity because life placed them in a situation where they finally experienced your side of the story. Someone else became distant with them. Someone gave an unclear response when they needed honesty. Someone made them wait for clarity that should have been offered freely. And suddenly they understood. Not intellectually. Emotionally. They understood how exhausting uncertainty can become when you genuinely care. They understood why you eventually stopped asking the same questions. They understood that silence does not always mean peace. Sometimes it means someone has grown tired of explaining what should already be visible. This realization did not make them feel defeated. It made them more mature. For perhaps the first time, they began looking at the past without asking, "Why did they pull away from me?" and instead asking, "What did my behavior make them feel?" That change in perspective is enormous. Because relationships rarely transform when someone is only focused on proving their intentions were good. They transform when a person becomes willing to understand the impact of what they did. That is what is beginning inside them. They know now that caring privately was never enough if their actions communicated uncertainty. They know that thinking about you constantly did not automatically make you feel chosen. They know that assuming you would always understand them placed an unfair burden on your patience. And they are beginning to recognize that if another chance for communication appears, they cannot arrive expecting you to simply understand everything they failed to express. They will need to speak clearly, calmly, without making you drag the truth from them. Yet something still makes them hesitate. It is not the lack of feeling. It is the awareness that you are different now. They sense that you may no longer be standing where they left you emotionally. And strangely, that does not make them want to give up. It makes them realize that approaching you again would require something more meaningful than a casual, "How have you been?" They know there are conversations that cannot be reopened with small talk forever. At some point, honesty must enter the room. At some point, someone has to say what the silence was actually hiding. At some point, the real question must be asked: did we walk away because we were wrong for each other, or because we were not ready to do this differently? You do not need to answer that question yet. Let it sit quietly for a moment. Because your heart may already know there is a difference between a connection that became unhealthy through repeated disregard and a connection that became lost through fear, immaturity, poor timing, or unspoken expectations. Not every unfinished story should be reopened. But not every unfinished story should be dismissed simply because its first chapter became difficult. What matters is whether the people involved have actually grown enough to write differently now. And that is where your attention belongs, not on whether the past was meaningful, because you already know it was, but on whether the future could become healthier. Don't rush this part. If this person appears again, you do not owe the old version of the relationship another opportunity. You are allowed to discover whether a new version is possible. Watch how they communicate when something feels uncomfortable. Notice whether they stay present instead of withdrawing. See whether they ask about your experience rather than only explaining theirs. Pay attention to whether their effort exists after the emotional conversation ends. Those details will tell you more than grand promises ever could. And something inside this person seems to understand that now. They are not only thinking about what they would say to get your attention. They are thinking about what they would need to do to keep your trust once they had it. That is a very different mindset. There was a time when they believed reconnecting with you would simply mean admitting they missed you. Now they know missing you is only the beginning. They would need to demonstrate that they learned from losing access to the version of you who once gave so much without demanding enough in return. And there is another surprising shift. They no longer see your boundaries as evidence that you care less. They are beginning to see them as evidence that you finally care about yourself enough to require something real. That realization has created respect where uncertainty once existed. In their mind, you are becoming less like someone waiting to be chosen and more like someone they would need to choose deliberately if they wanted a place beside you. Stay till the end, because what happened next quietly brought everything closer to the surface. Recently, this person encountered something connected to your past together. It may have been an old photograph, a saved conversation, a familiar place, an object, a date, or even a phrase someone said that reminded them immediately of you. The memory itself was not unusual. What was unusual was their reaction. Instead of feeling only sadness, they felt warmth. And beneath the warmth came something they had not expected: gratitude. For the first time, they stopped viewing the connection only through the lens of what went wrong and started recognizing what it had given them. You showed them a kind of emotional depth they had not known they were capable of experiencing. You challenged habits they had mistaken for personality. You made them question why they were so comfortable staying guarded. You taught them, perhaps without realizing it, that being loved well can expose the places where you have not yet learned to receive love well. That is why you stayed in their mind. Not because you were impossible to forget, but because knowing you changed the way they understood themselves. And once someone recognizes that, it becomes difficult to reduce the relationship to a simple mistake. They began wondering whether the connection was not something they were supposed to escape, but something they were supposed to learn how to meet more maturely. Yet hear this carefully: the fact that someone learns from you does not mean you must automatically let them return. Your future is not a reward for their realization. Your heart is not a classroom where someone can repeatedly disappear and come back whenever they learn another lesson. You still get to choose what is healthy for you. That choice is what keeps this story grounded. And ironically, your ability to choose freely may be what gives any future reconciliation its best chance of becoming real. Because if you reconnect, it should not happen because you were afraid to lose them. It should happen because two people looked honestly at what happened and consciously decided they were capable of something better. That difference changes everything. Imagine for a moment that you did speak again. Not dramatically. Maybe the conversation begins quietly. They ask how you have been, and for once they actually listen to the answer. You notice something different in their tone. Less performance. Less avoidance. They do not immediately try to pull you back into familiarity. Instead, they acknowledge the space that exists. They recognize that time has passed. They admit that they have thought about what happened. And then perhaps there is a pause. The kind of pause where both people know the surface conversation has reached its limit. That is where the old version of them would have changed the subject. But the person they are becoming might finally say, "There is something I should have told you a long time ago." Would you hear them? Perhaps you would. Hearing someone does not mean surrendering your power. It simply gives truth an opportunity to appear. And the truth they are moving toward is not some dramatic declaration. It is more vulnerable than that. They are starting to realize they did not distance themselves because you meant too little. They distanced themselves because you began to mean enough that the outcome mattered. They could imagine disappointment. They could imagine losing you. They could imagine being fully seen and then rejected. So instead of risking those possibilities, they created smaller versions of the very outcome they feared. They became inconsistent. They created uncertainty. They stepped away before life had the chance to decide anything naturally. And eventually, the connection became strained by the very protection they thought would keep them safe. That pattern is finally visible to them. Once a pattern becomes visible, continuing it becomes a choice rather than an unconscious habit. That is why this moment matters. They are standing near a decision. Not necessarily about sending a message tonight or tomorrow, but about the kind of person they want to be when love asks something real of them again. Do they retreat? Or do they communicate? Do they allow pride to speak first? Or do they finally risk being understood? There is quiet movement inside them toward the second option. Something important is waiting for you because you may also be standing near a decision. You may have thought your only choices were to keep waiting or to close your heart completely. But perhaps there is a third path. Move forward without bitterness. Release the responsibility for making anything happen. Keep building your life. Keep protecting your peace. And if this person eventually approaches you with genuine clarity, decide from who you are then, not from who you were when the distance first began. That path gives you freedom without forcing an ending. It allows possibilities without depending on them. It honors what you felt without making your happiness conditional on someone else's timing. And that may be the strongest form of hope available to you. Not blind hope. Not endless waiting. Grounded hope, the willingness to believe something meaningful can still evolve while remaining completely willing to choose yourself if it does not. There is something beautiful about reaching that place, because suddenly you no longer need every answer today. You no longer have to decode every silence. You no longer have to know exactly what they are thinking at every moment. Their next actions will eventually tell you what their thoughts cannot. And you will be able to respond with clarity because you stop trying to carry both sides of the story. But the story is not finished yet. There is one final reason this person has been unable to send the connection entirely into the past, and it has almost nothing to do with nostalgia. They recently asked themselves a question they had been avoiding from the beginning: if I met this person today, knowing everything I know now, would I still choose to know them? They expected uncertainty. Instead, the answer came almost immediately. Yes. But the answer surprised them for another reason. They did not want the old relationship back. They wanted the possibility of meeting you again as the people you have both become. And when that thought entered their mind, the unfinished message they had once abandoned suddenly no longer felt like something from the past. It felt like the beginning of a conversation they may finally be becoming brave enough to have. Yet there is one thing they have decided they would need to tell you first, something deeper than, "I miss you," deeper than, "I was wrong," and more revealing than anything they have admitted before. That truth explains why they never fully walked away emotionally, even when everything on the outside made it appear that they had. And that is where the next part begins.